This video will cover a few different things in p5play. We'll be covering mouse input and sprite, so how to click on a sprite and have something happen. Also hover and other things like that. How to create multiple sprites over time, so like creating a spawner where a new sprite gets introduced every second or half a second. And then kind of putting those two things together, so kind of a simple interactive game-like thing where sprites are being spawned in and you have to click on them before they leave the screen. So the first step is, first, how do we create a sprite that responds to mouse input? For example, a mouse click. So I've got a p5.js sketch here that's got the p5play libraries imported already. I'm going to create a new variable called mySprite up here, and then use that in setup and assign it to a new sprite to create one at the center of the screen. So 200, 200, and I'll make it a diameter of 100. Okay, so mouse input is actually pretty simple. There is, similarly to how the keyboard press is handled. You can check for presses or pressing. Now you have to specify, which sprite you're listening to, or you want to listen for input to. And again, it has to, whenever you're checking for input, you have to do it within the draw loop because you don't know when the user is going to be pressing the mouse button. So again, in this case, we can say if, and we want to reference again this mySprite because we want to respond to a click when you click on this particular sprite. And so then the key thing here is .mouses, and mouse. So you say sprite.mouse. Then you can say dot, and then there's a few different functions that you can listen to that will kind of return true or false based on whether or not the user is pressing that sprite or hovering over whatever function you use. So like keyboard input, the function names are presses and pressing. And the difference being that press is, if we print something to the console and try running this, if I click, each time I click, it will increment this one time. So there's one frame where this returns true when the user holds the button down initially. Pressing is different. Let's try that out. So this one, you press once and it's got 6 frames of hit, because even though I pressed it really quickly, it was still being held down 6 frames. So as long as this button is being held down on the sprite, you can see it's counting up in the console. Also notice that I'm clicking over here outside the circle and it's not responding because it's associated with this sprite by using mySprite.mouse.pressing. 2 other things here to note is that we also have 2 other functions similarly named. One for hovers that returns true the first frame you start hovering. So if we were to run this, notice that I'm currently hovering over it. I'm not pressing any buttons, but once I enter that circle, this hit appeared in the console. And if I say hovering, it will return this value, this function will return true if you're hovering over the sketch. And you can see it's counting up as long as my mouse is over that circle. Okay, the second part of this video is a bit different. So let's just think about how, a lot of games have this scenario where multiple sprites are being spawned as the game plays. By spawned I just mean new ones are being introduced to the game that appear, and you have to respond or do something with those sprites. So in this case, it's going to be different, right? We don't want to have the sprite being created in setup, because that only happens the first frame, and we want those sprites to be introduced as the game progresses, which means that we have to keep track of time in some way, or have some sort of counter that says once we reach that counter, then let's create a new sprite. So that's the first step. Let's just create a counter, and we'll do this a simple way. There's a lot of different ways to do this, but I'm just going to create a count variable, and in my draw function I'm going to say count plus plus. What that means is just every time through the loop, every time draw gets called, it will add 1 to count. And if we were to just print out what that count value would be, it should just start at 0 and go and be increment one at a time. And actually I have a problem because I did not initialize my count variable. All right, so now if I do that, you can see we should have starting at 0, and each time through the draw loop it'll add 1, and then do that over and over and over again. Okay, so how do we then use this to create a new sprite at a given moment? So let's say we want 60 frames to pass before we create a sprite. What we can do is we can just listen to see when this count variable hits 60, right, all the way down here. And at that moment, let's create a sprite. So we can use a conditional, an if statement, and say if count is greater than 60, then let's create a sprite. And you can do equals 60, that would be fine as well, as long as you make sure that you don't change how fast this thing is counting and you suddenly add 3 each time or add 4 each time and it skips over 5 each, 6 each, 7 each time and it skips over 60, because then you'd be in trouble. So I like to usually just use greater than, a little bit more flexible. So in this case, what we want to do is let's create the sprite after it reaches 60, which should be pretty familiar by now. New sprite equals new sprite, and I'm going to put it, and let's put it at the top of the screen, because we're going to want to, what I want to do is kind of have these sprites be introduced to the top of the screen and then have them move down. So let's just put it as at the middle of the screen, the X, which is 200, top of the screen Y, which is 0, and then let's make it, let's say 50. So if we run this, you'll see that what's happening here? Well, we've got this flickering circle at the top of the screen. Why is this happening? Well, it waited for 60 frames, and then every frame after 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, it will create a new sprite. So it's actually creating a new sprite every frame after that 60, which is not what we want. We want it to just make one and then kind of reset that counter so that it has to, there's another 60 seconds that passes before a new one is introduced. So what we can do is we can say count equals 0. So then what's going to happen, it's going to count up to 60, get to 61, execute this, and restart the counter. So it'll have to count up to 60 again, or 61 to be exact, before it creates another sprite on the screen. So if we press this, we should see we have one sprite, and then every 60 frames we create another one on top of that. And we can see the different color change to reflect that. Now, the other thing I wanted, what I mentioned, was to have some sort of, have them move down from the top of the screen. We can do that very easily from what we know about movement and just say vel.y, and if we give it just a positive value, they should now move down the screen. Great. So now we have these sprites being introduced every 60 seconds. Another one gets introduced at the top of the screen. To be, if this was a game where you're kind of avoiding these sprites or something like that, or even in this game that I'm going to create, it would be good to kind of delete these sprites as they move off the screen, and you can do that relatively easily. But just in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of keep going. So the last part of this, well, let's make it kind of an interesting game. So let's introduce a little bit of randomness. So let's make it so that a random position on the x-axis that it gets that it gets spawned. So we can do that really easily by just saying, that x value, change that to a random number between 0 and 400. So now we should have them being introduced in random positions. We can also, make it random the size of these as well. So maybe we make it between 20 and 50. So now we should have randomly spawning circles that are a random size and a random x position. And you can imagine a simple game where you just have to click on these circles, and you might want to speed up the while. You can make them spawn faster if you wanted to make this a little bit more difficult. But let's see how we could create this game so if you click on them, they'll disappear, and then you could actually count the number of ones that you've hit or end the game when you miss one. So how do we do this? Well, we know that we had in the past, when I showed you how to respond to mouse input, we did the sprite. We'd say sprite.mouse.presses or pressing to respond to input. Now, we would need to, if we were to try to do this, the problem here is that we need to check for all of the sprites that we're creating. And we're not really keeping these sprites around, because when I have this variable called new sprite, this is just the new one that we create. So it's not holding this in memory in this new sprite variable. Plus, I'm declaring this new sprite within this if statement, and it doesn't exist outside of it, because when you declare a variable, it only exists in the title scope that you're giving it. So, where it exists. So how do we check for all of the sprites that we've created up until that point? Now, there is a variable called allSprites. Essentially, what this is a list. It's an array of all the sprites that you've created so far in your p5play sketch. So what we can do is we can create and I'll just kind of label this spawner, and then let's check for clicks. So how do we check for clicks? Well, we can use this allSprites array, and we can use a for loop to go through that array and check for each sprite in that allSprites array. Let's see if it's currently being pressed, and if so, let's destroy it. So a for loop. I'll just comment this out. Maybe I'll just put this in this comment, say check for clicks, use allSprites. And and it's an array. So again, a for loop. And what we want to do is loop through, let's just say let I equals 0 as where you want this for loop to start, with a variable called I starting at 0. We want it to loop through all of the number, basically loop through the number of sprites that we have in our allSprites array. We can do that with allSprites.length. Should return the number currently in that array, and then we can say I equals I plus 1 or I plus plus. So each time through the loop, this I variable will be incremented. And then lastly, we need to do that check for if the mouse is being pressed on the sprite. And we can use this, so we can use a conditional within this if statement to check to see for each one of these sprites in the array. We can do that with sprites.I, because each time we're basically looping through this from 0 to the number of sprites in our array. And then we can access each one of those using that I as an index, each one of those spots in the array, and say .mouse.press is, and we can't forget our parentheses there. So now hopefully this will respond to a click on that mouse, and we can check on that sprite. And we can at first just, let's just change the color, maybe make it red, to see if this is actually working. So here come the sprites. If I click on them, there we go. Then they're turning red. A little harder than I thought. Okay, so the last step here is let's just make sure that how do we delete these sprites instead of turning them red? And there's just a remove function that we can use on any given sprite to get rid of it. So we can just, instead of saying color, we can just say remove, and then that should get rid of the sprite when you click on it. Great.